Hello, everyone. My name is Danny Bravo Alvarado, and I'm here to talk about the race and ethnicity um, in sports. So this is my presentation, and it's going to revolve around Jackie Robinson, and tailing around the types of racism that he faced during his time. But I also want to talk about some of the trailblazers that happened before and after Jackie Robinson, that I will further discuss during the presentation. So the way I have this set up is I will start off with the origins and the evolution of racism and equality in sports, then the impact of racial inequality on athletes and communities, the activism and resistance in sports, the research on racial inequalities in sports, organizations that help fight racism, and then some of the potential solutions for racism, and talk about the future research and recommendations section, and finally the conclusion uh, about and the takeaways that I got from doing this research. And so yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So, some of the origins and evolution of racial inequality in sports. So, the pre-integration era in the early 20th century, professionals and organized sports were predominantly segregated, featuring separate leagues and facilities for black and white. So, one thing that stands out in this aspect is the Negro leagues at the time and the Major League Baseball, which was whites only during that time. And so that's that level of segregation in sports that comes into play during Jackie Robinson's era. And then some of the trailblazers that I want to talk about before Jackie Robinson is Jack Johnson. I actually learned about him in my undergrad program in Cal Poly Pomona for my uh, and for kinesiology. And he's actually one of the first athletes of color that I learned about in that class, and it was a sports ethics class as well. And so Jackie Robinson, or Jack Johnson, sorry, was the first African American heavyweight champion in boxing. And if you can see on your right, he is fighting the so-called Great White Hope at the time. His name is Jim Jeffries. And so during that time, because Jack Johnson won the heavyweight title, he was seen as kind of like the villain of white supremacy, and kind of like the outlaw of white supremacy. And so the white community at the time was trying to restore that white supremacy back where it belonged. And they thought it was going to be Jim Jeffries, but it wasn't. In 1910 in Reno, Nevada, he fought against Jack Johnson, and he came short. And Jack Johnson retained the title. And Jack Johnson wasn't your normal, athlete of color, because he was rich. He just outlawed everything during that time. He dated white women, and during that time, even looking at a white woman the wrong way, and you were an African American or individual of color, you would, sometimes face death. And so he was really the outlaw um, during that time. And then we go back to Tommy Smith, as you can see on your left. He's doing the salute, the Black Power salute, and this happened in 1968 in the Olympics in New Mexico. And so you can't see in the picture, but he has him and John Carlos, which is in third place. They're not wearing shoes, and that's to represent the poverty that African Americans faced during that time. And you can see John Tommy Smith, which is in first place. He's holding a box, and that's basically to demonstrate the racial inequalities that happened in America. And John Carlos, you can't really see it in the picture, but he's wearing a rope around his neck, and that was to represent um, the lynching that was going on during that time. And so this is really powerful because he's using the sport as a platform, but not just that. He's showing the world all the racial inequalities that were happening. And as we know, the Civil Rights Act happened in 1964, but yet they were still, 4 years later, still enduring some of the racial inequalities um, during that time. And then the ongoing struggle, despite the advancements, despite all these different laws put into place, athletes of color was still encountering institutional racism and systemic, obstacles within the realm of sports. The challenges range from bias hiring practices and limited opportunities to the silencing of their perspectives and continuous use of sport as a platform for activism. So, trying to gain that genuine equity and inclusion still remains a struggle. So, the impact of racial inequalities on athletes. So, during my research, I really wanted to put myself in the shoes of, in athletes of color or individuals of color during that time. And I would only imagine that it would take a psychological and emotional toll on that individual just because, you know, um, Jackie Robinson was all he wanted to do was play baseball, but yet he had to face all that adversity, all the different forms of racism, all the death threats that he received. And that really took a toll on him. And if you're a kid at that time and you're seeing that and you're witnessing that as well, that you kind of relate all the different negativity that he faced. And so I would, think that it would definitely set an impact on individuals of color, and then undermining athletes' potential. So the systemic racism and bias often restricts the opportunities and resources accessible to athletes of color, impeding their capacity to achieve their utmost potential. So these are some of the limitations that athletes of color face because they didn't have the same level of resources, and to some degree today that is still the case, and that's something that I will further talk down in my presentation. But it can really affect an individual's skill set and can really affect an athlete's mentality as well. And it also had a community impact. So the exclusion and marginalization of athletes of color in sports can deeply affect the communities they represent. It can perpetuate that feeling of not belonging, that alienization, that all these, athletes of color, individuals of color face during this time because they were kind of put aside. They did not belong in American society. So, that just demonstrates the huge impact that racism had during this time for individuals of color. Activism and resistance in sports. So, athletes of color often use their platform to really voice their opinion, and I couldn't really just what I really thought about in this section was the fact that a couple years ago, LeBron James used his sports platform to really talk about the police brutality, George Floyd's murder during that time, and um, during that time, ESPN's Lauren Ingram really talked about how he should just shut up and dribble the basketball when he was voicing his opinion that it wasn't correct for the officers what they did to George Floyd and the police brutality that was going on at that time. Now, granted, this woman was the sports analyst um, was white and so is white, and so just imagine someone of color saying those remarks to an individual. They would receive all that backlash within an instant. So that demonstrates that systemic racism now that's still going on today. And then the organizational initiatives. So there's several sports organizations and governing bodies, including the NCAA, CIF, the NAACP, um, that pretty much try to construct programs that are inclusion of diversity, and they're confronting racial diversity, and they're designed to provide opportunities to help support athletes of color, and that's really empowering because that gives that hope for athletes of color. Um, and then the community empowerment. Grassroots organizations and community-based initiatives have been a pivotal in empowering athletes of color and amplifying their voices, being able to use that platform to really voice their opinions on controversial topics. I feel like this is really important because um, these athletes of color now have a fan base of all demographics. And so just being able to advocate for change in certain topics or sensitive topics that can really come a long way in helping just bringing that awareness to everyone. And then examining the research in racial inequality in sports. So the scholarship insights, gaps and limitations, and the implication for change. So the scholarly literature has derived into complex interplay between race, ethnicity, and sports, and it explores topics on the basis of hiring practices. And so this just goes back to what I was talking about in that systemic racism, where the level of equity and trying to hire someone in a higher position just really goes on the basis of the color of their skin. For example, in baseball, the majority, the people in power are the majority are white, and so I feel that these organizations can give these individuals the appropriate opportunity to apply to these certain positions, not through the basis of their skin, but just like Dr. King said, on the basis of their character, on the knowledge that they know, on the expertise, on the level of professionalism that this individual provides. I feel could be a way in which you can set that level of equity, that balance in the hiring process of these individuals. And then some of the gaps and limitations. So while the current research has shed light on many aspects of racial inequality, there are also still that lack of understanding, bringing more in-depth studies of longitudinal analysis, and the interdisciplinary approaches that are needed to fully capture the evolving dynamics of the issue of racism, which I'll further elaborate in the next couple slides. And then just the implication of change, finding from existing research having significant implications for deriving positive change and addressing these systemic barriers that are faced by athletes of color. So, policymakers, sports organizations, and educational institutions can leverage this insight to develop more effective interventions and promote that greater equity and inclusion in world sports. Not that it's not being done today, there is a large improvement from what it was in Jackie Robinson's era. But I feel like there's more to change that can still be implemented to further improve that racial inequality in sports that we have today. And then just to spotlight some of these organizations that really fight racial inequality. These are the significant resources, and the three that really much stood out to me were Kick It Out, Rise, and the NAACP. Excuse me. Kick It Out. It's a prominent organization in the United Kingdom, and they provide education, training, and support to address racism. And they don't want anything to do with racism. They promote inclusion. The sport that they practice is soccer or football, as it's known over there in the United Kingdom. But they very much address all the racism and any forms of prejudice that happens in the sport and try to provide solutions for them, and just really exclude racism from even coming on board in that organization. And Rise, so Rise is Ross Initiative in Sports for Equality. This is a nonprofit organization in the US that leverages power of sport by addressing racial inequalities and promote social justice. They partner with professional leagues, teams, and athletes to develop educational programs and advocate for change. And what I really like about Rise is, they provide that educational programs for the youth to teach them about what happened, and trying to prevent that cycle of hate and that racism that our predecessors did before us. And so I think that's really powerful because the youth is the future, and for them to thrive and have that mindset of ending racism, I think that's really huge, and impactful for the future. And the NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So this is a really old organization that has been doing their um, using their platform to address all these racial inequalities since Marcus Garvey's day. And so this is one of the oldest organizations out there that really address racial discrimination on all platforms, in sports, and in workplace, in the community, out in society. So this is a really good organization that has been doing this justice for so long. And then some of the potential solutions that can go on to try to bring or eliminate racism, and that's policy and governance, athlete empowerment, and then just the community engagement. So for the policy and governance, it's just to implement policies and frameworks within sports organizations that prioritize, diverse equity and inclusion, ensuring that there is fair hiring practices, and just representation at all levels of leadership, and really giving that equal opportunity to every individual that has that knowledge, that has all these expertise in that position that they're looking to apply for. I think that's key, having that level of equity and balance. And then the athlete empowerment, provide athletes of color with the necessary support, that mentorship, platforms to amplify their voices, advocate for change, and serve as role models for the next generation of diverse athletes. Like I said before, athletes really have a gift. They have a huge fan base that is from different demographics, and they can really take a toll on these individuals' mentality and strive for change. And so I think athletes using their platform or their sport as a platform to really advocate for change and voice their opinions on all these controversial topics, specifically on racism, can really help further extract or further implement that change for the long run. And then community engagement. It fosters stronger connections and collaborations between sports organizations, educational institutions, local communities to create pathways for underrepresented groups to access and thrive in sports related opportunities. And to further elaborate on that, I feel that it's important to provide, and I'll further speak on this on the next slide. Is just bringing the resources, the same level of resources in every single community will be super impactful, as it will allow them to further develop their skill set, further develop their persona, their personality, um, and just give them the same level of opportunity that all these other athletes and higher end communities are having on a day-to-day basis. And then the future research, directions and recommendations in sports. And so for the first one, intersectionality and analyzing race and ethnicity. So I feel like more studies need to be done on the treatment of athletes, in terms of athletes of color and the bias that they face from coaches and officials, and fans and even some of their teammates. I feel like there is a lack of research on that area, and I feel that that's something important. We can further research and elaborate on, in terms of seeing the treatment that these athletes are getting on a day-to-day basis from the coaches, officials, and the fans. And then number two, conducting long-term just studies on the progression, the setbacks, evolving the dynamics of racial inequality in sports, enabling these researchers to identify trends, patterns, and the effectiveness of interventions over time. Just pretty much to try to find that research, or further elaborate on that type of research. And then the last one, which is research on athletes of color, the socioeconomic status. So athletes from color, uh, conducting studies on the socioeconomic backgrounds. And it's just going back to the level of resources, because some of these communities have the lack of resources, such as, a quality training facility, quality coaching, quality equipment, the financial constraints that limit them to participate in competitive leagues or travel for tournaments, affecting their skill development, or even exposing them to different scouts or recruiters that normally won't be in a place as like Beverly Hills, for example. And so I think having that level, that same level of field in play, that balance, again, having the same level of resources as high-end communities, I think would be really effective and impactful for every athlete to compete at the same level and strive to be great. And you can see that greatness, and recruiters will be able to see that greatness and recruit, and adapt all these different players from different backgrounds and demographics. I think that would serve as a same level of equality for every single athlete. And then the conclusion. So some of the conclusion and takeaways of my presentation, or the research that was done. Um, so the many forms of racism that was responsible for the hardships that athletes of color faced during Jackie Robinson's era. You know, we it's a topic that you can just keep going on, and it's a really sensitive topic because not everyone wants to talk about racism. And sometimes you don't even face racism from, let's say, another a white person, for example. um I growing up, I felt that I received racism from my own from my own ethnicity, from my own background, being Mexican American in this country, and living in LA, living in South Central, going through all that gang violence. I feel that I face racism in terms of my own people of my own color, to so to say. And so trailblazers such as Jack Johnson, Jackie Robinson, and Tommy Smith really set the pavement for future athletes of color to strive in the sports realm. So we really have to be salute to them, and really be thankful, and show some gratitude to these iconic um, trailblazers, because they were the ones that really endured heavy racism during their time. And even if they endured that racism, they had a smile on their face, and did everything they could to kind of backlash that racism, and bring it uh bring it to an end for the greater good, for the future. And that's what these trailblazers did. They really set that pavement for athletes nowadays to be able to strive in the sport that they're passionate about. And then organizations like, the NAACP, Kick It Out, and Rise, they're just perfect examples of organizations that are fighting against racism and are coming close to eliminating racism in all platforms and all sports. And I think that these organizations are really important for the future. So the future can pretty much eliminate racism on all forms of racism. And then I feel like bringing awareness, teaching the youth, and shedding light on these issues will bring that call to action to really fully exterminate racism. As a physical education teacher, I really want to kind of implement these ideas as best as I can, as appropriate as I can to my students, so they can kind of transcribe all that information and um, really kind of demonstrate it or tackle these issues in their own way but in a positive manner, to really further eliminate racism, and the youth is the future, so if you're I really feel that racism is taught. It's not something that it's not a trait that you're born with, and so very much teaching these students the different solutions, and ways they can approach racism, I think will be really effective for them, and they will transcribe that in their own way and further eliminate racism in the future, hopefully. And then some of the takeaways that I did on all of this research was just really much going further in depth, and researching these topics and discovering new avenues I didn't know before. And I did know about the Negro Leagues, but not to the extent, in terms of the statistics they have. Like if you compare the Negro Leagues to Major League Baseball, these statistics are just, over just very much better than the major leagues, but I'm saying that in terms of I didn't know that, so that's pretty awesome to see. And then just learning about Tommy Smith, I further elaborated on what they were wearing, and what or how they use their platform to really kind of just demonstrate to the whole world that the US, it's not what they portray themselves to be. It was in the land of the free during that time. And so I feel like Tommy Smith and John Carlos really shine and really represented that to the whole world, using the Olympics to really further voice their opinion on that is awesome as well. And then just the harsh realities of racism that Jackie Robinson, and those before him went through. I think, um, and just going on to my last point, I'll further elaborate on that. But I think that's just, it's just can't imagine that, the US was really like that back in the day, so that's, it's really tough to really a tough pill to swallow, but and it's important to really recognize and realize all these different topics, or all the racism that individuals of color went through. And then just going to my third point is just really admiring and admiring these athletes of color, individuals of color, because they had the courage to endure all of that racism. And, they could have easily started another civil war. They could have easily acted out on violence, just like how Malcolm X had, in his ideas. But that's, another topic for another day. But, just really admiring these individuals for the courage that they demonstrated, and they didn't give up on fighting racial inequality. And so that's why we narrowed down that racism, um, to now having it systemically. And then my last point is just, I always, like putting myself in people's shoes. So I would just wonder how things would play out, if I put myself in Jackie Robinson's shoes. I can very much, see how that can take a toll on an individual's mind, on their physique, on their emotions, on their well-being. And I think that's important, because you really want to be empathetic, and I feel like that's how we can kind of relate towards each other when we put ourselves into other people's shoes. Um, and so yeah, this was my presentation. I hope all of you enjoyed it. Thank you, Dr. Robles, for really challenging and really just opening up my mind on all these different topics, and doing all this research to further elaborate myself on the knowledge. Um, of these topics. And further down the line, I really do want to shed light and pass this on to the youth, so they can kind of turn it into their own, um, turn it into their own, and hopefully they can end this the systemic racism that is happening nowadays in the future. So thank you, and have a great summer.